Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Miri Cypers, and I have the privilege of serving as the Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League's Pacific Northwest office. As you might know, ADL has been working for over a century across the country and for 75 years in the Pacific Northwest in furtherance of our mission, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure fair and just treatment to all. Through educational programs in schools, community training, advocacy, and responding to acts of bigotry, we take a holistic approach to fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Today's program was inspired by something simple. A few months ago, I reached out to Li-Ching Tran Wong, who didn't know I was telling you about this, a fellow mom in my community, to share more information about ADL's work and get her thoughts on becoming involved. Through our conversation, we began speaking about the many similarities between the Jewish American and Asian American communities, and an idea was born to host a program for both of our communities celebrating our Heritage Month this May. We both acknowledge that our communities are currently suffering from stereotyping, misunderstanding, and an uptick in hate, yet we can't be defined by only our challenges. We're resilient, we're strong, we're diverse, and we have long and storied histories and distinct cultures and traditions. I hope that today's program is the first, but certainly not the last, in efforts to appreciate each other's perspectives, gain nuance into each other's identities, and build long-term friendships. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to quickly thank all of our wonderful co-hosts, the Asian Hall of Fame, the Washington State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs, the Holocaust Center for Humanity, ICHS, the International Examiner, JCL Seattle, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Seattle, JFS, the Jewish Family Service, OCA Greater Seattle, the Robert Chinn Foundation, and Temple to Hirsch Sinai. I'm really honored to introduce the wonderful Lori Matsukawa, who's going to be moderating today's program. She is an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist with more than 40 years in the industry, who retired after 36 years as an anchor and reporter at King TV in Seattle. She also won 2 Emmy Awards for series about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and another for her series on a photographer's mission to photograph VSA veterans who served as part of America's greatest generation. She holds a BA from Stanford University, an MA in communication from UW, and we are so appreciative of you and our other speakers. Thank you so much, Lori, and take it away. And for those who are participating today, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A as we get to the end. Thank you.
Got to remember to unmute. Thank you so much, Miri. And again, we welcome your questions. Please go ahead and put your questions in Q&A. I think we're going to be looking at the Q&A queue in particular. So we welcome your questions. Let me go on. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate today. It's such an honor to celebrate Asian American Heritage and Jewish Heritage Month together. I think this is a wonderful idea. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Let me introduce you to our panelists. Rabbi Will Berkovitz is the CEO of Jewish Family Service, overseeing philanthropic, volunteer, and advocacy support for vulnerable individuals and families in the Puget Sound region, including refugees, immigrants, and those experiencing homelessness, including refugees. Before coming to JFS, Rabbi Will was Senior Vice President and Rabbi in Residence at Repair the World. And before that, he served as Rabbi and Executive Director of Hillel at the University of Washington and J-Connect Seattle. You may have read some of his columns in the Washington Post, the HuffPost, and the Seattle Times. Our other panelist, Ron Chu, is an author, journalist, retired museum and foundation executive, community organizer, and lifelong resident of Seattle. In his newest book, My Unforgotten Seattle, Ron chronicles his life growing up in the Chinatown International District as the son of Chinese immigrants, finding his voice in community journalism, first as a reporter and then executive editor of the International Examiner, and creating a national model for community collaboration as executive director of the Wing Luk Asian Museum. He just retired this year as executive director of the International Community Health Services Foundation and is an avid runner. So welcome, Ron and Will. Thank you so much. First question, what connections come to mind when you think about Asian American and Jewish American heritage? Will.
I think for me, the things that pop into my mind, actually, interestingly, and probably not ideally, is the similarity around Japanese internment in the United States and the Holocaust in Europe, and just that sense of being part of but other as well as just this desire to be, I think, to some degree, really wanting to be part of the American United States project and really trying to lean into that, and then at times being told you can be here so far, but not totally. And I think we'll talk probably more about some of that, but those are the things that pop into my mind.
Thank you, Will. And Ron.
Yeah, well, just to share a personal story, when I was growing up, and as Lori mentioned, my parents are both immigrants, and my father worked as a waiter at the old Hong Kong restaurant. Any people who have lived in Seattle for a long time remember that restaurant. I just remember working there from age 13 through college. The customers that gravitated towards my father were the Jewish families that come around the weekend, and invariably they were the customers that left the biggest tips. They were the ones who took time to talk to my father and treated him like a human being. And I always remembered that. That always stuck in my brain, and was always curious about what our connections might be. Later, when I was working for a brief time at the Washington State Commission on Asian American Affairs, there was an Asian Jewish summit that was organized. It was probably in the 1980s. I remember Barbara Hirsch with the Jewish Federation was involved with that, and through that I began to see really a lot of similarities, as Will mentioned, in terms of our experience here in this country.
It's interesting that you would mention the consideration and the relationship building that was going on between members of both communities, Ron, because I was recently informed about a book that's about to come up. It's a graphic novel by a young man who is, let me grab his name real here. His name is Josh Tuininga. And he is writing, or he has written, this graphic novel about his great-grandfather. He noticed when he was much younger that when his great-grandfather died and they had his service at a synagogue in Seward Park, there were the usual relatives and people in the community, but there were also several Japanese Americans who came to pay their respects. And Josh wanted to know, who are these people and why are they here for my great-grandpa's service? Well, it turns out these were descendants of people that Josh's great-grandpa, Marco Calvo, had helped when Japanese Americans were sent to the concentration camps during the war. Without telling anyone, including his family, Mr. Calvo bought the houses being desperately sold by the Japanese American families for $1. And while they were away, Mr. Calvo rented out the homes, paid the property taxes, and kept the vandals away, of course. And when the war was over and the families came back, Mr. Calvo sold the houses back to the families for $1 and gave them whatever rent money was left over after paying taxes. So basically, these families had a home to come back to after camp. And so this relationship was just remarkable, and the families were close for the rest of their lives. And so it was just a surprise for this great-grandson, Josh, to hear this story. and realize what had happened. And I think it just shows that kind of shared humanity, that kind of decency, the way the community, members of the community treated one another. Very typical, maybe for Seattle. I don't know how typical it was elsewhere, but that's kind of what happened in Seward Park, Seattle, right? Will, do you have a
Well,
comment on that?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. If I could just jump in front of Will for just a second, share one additional story. When I began working at the Wing Museum as director, and I began circulating in the neighborhood, very similar story with a Jewish couple that took care of a business called Hego Variety Store. It was one of those 5 and 10 cent stores back in the day. The Murakami family that operated the store ended up being incarcerated, but there was a Jewish couple that took care of the store and protected it, paid the bills, so that the family could come back after the war and have a business to restart. It was one of the few businesses that simply restarted afterwards. And I remember talking to Murakami sisters about that. I said, because there were actually a number of people who had wanted a storefront space, which was next door to Hego, operated by the Jewish couple. And Murakami said, no, we're not entertaining any other outside parties, because you see, that family took care of our business for us. And it wasn't literally until the couple passed away that it was opened up for another tenant. So as you mentioned, there are these kind of very deep relationships that stick in my mind in terms of how the communities are knitted together.
That's interesting. I think one thing that I think is that I reflect a lot on is actually, so my dad, who died when he was 90, he had a very diverse group of friends, and he didn't talk about it. It wasn't like an intellectual act, like I'm going to go seek out an Asian American friend. It was like, these are just the people who he knew who were around him. And there was something very organic about the nature of those relationships. And, you know, when I was growing up, my best friend, actually all the way through pretty much high school, when we sort of just went off to college, was an Asian American kid. And again, it wasn't like I'm going to go seek out this type of person. It was like, this is just the guy who you sit next to in school, and then you start to get to know their family and you become part of their family. And I think that those organic relationships are so critical to that kind of development. And then as you have those kind of organic relationships, you can have much more authentic conversations about shared experience and shared life and shared history. And I think that is at core. And I think some folks, based on just what you're describing, like it's just more intuitive to how they are in the world. And I wonder a little bit sometimes as we look to today how that is manifesting and how it's different.
one thing that I'm curious about was the role of redlining back then, back during the war years and shortly afterward. There were very few places where Asian American families could actually buy homes. So that's why they were pretty much restricted to Beacon Hill. Like they couldn't buy in Windermere. They really couldn't buy, north of the Ship Canal and downtown Seattle. It was very limited. And so I'm wondering if there was an aspect of housing and redlining that contributed to these relationships. Like maybe the Jewish community and the Asian American community were forced to live in the same neighborhood, whether they wanted to or not.
Well, I know just from my research, and our family moved up to Beacon Hill in the late 1950s and 60s. There were restricted covenants in place on Beacon Hill. And they weren't simply targeting African Americans, Asian Americans. Jews were also part of the restrictive covenants. And so there was a period where I think our mutual communities began to migrate into new neighborhoods around the same time. And perhaps some of those relationships began forming around that same time. So there's shared, that obviously we we both communities struggle with this notion of, as Will mentioned, this otherness, who we are in the fabric of America, issues of how we're held up as a model minority. But there's ways in which we both have migrated into the mainstream, but then continue not to be accepted at certain times when things flare up inevitably overseas and then affect us here, that have parallels.
Yeah, I'd sort of say a couple things I would just add to that. So, I grew up in Minneapolis, and so the Jewish ghetto, or the ghetto, as the Jewish ghetto, as my mom used to call it, where she grew up, it's exactly what you just described, Ron. Just Jews were not allowed to live anywhere else. And then as the quote unquote ghetto opened up, and the first suburb that allowed the Jewish community to be a part of that community, how that started to change. And one of the things I would observe is Jews, and I'm speaking at the moment primarily of Ashkenazic Jews, that's the experience I can most authentically speak to, is if you're white, if you perceive yourself as white, you're allowed you can be part of this society to a degree. But if you are going to maintain a tightness to your Jewish identity, you're going to be perceived as other, and you'll be suspect. And that actually internally within the Jewish community, and I think this probably is true for the Asian community, the Asian Pacific Islander community, I'm sure it's true for other first generation immigrants, is you damn well better marry another Jewish person. And if you marry someone who's not Jewish, in that, I'm talking about a particular generation of that first generation Americans, that was very taboo and frowned upon. And it led to, in the Jewish community, some real, like, well, why would I want to be a part of a community that won't let me be who I want to be? And it led to, I think, some pretty significant challenges in terms of internally within aspects of the Jewish community. I don't know if that's true in the Asian Pacific Islander community.
Let's amplify that a little bit. It's one thing if you're like Ron and you are visibly part of a minority community, an ethnic community, and then if you're a Jew who happens to look very white, and maybe if it wasn't for your name or the fact that you wore your yarmulke or something like that, they would never have guessed that you're Jewish. How is it different being a visibly noticeable minority and then a not so visible minority? Can you both discuss that, Ron?
Well, certainly in this current time period with the pandemic, the impact has been pretty awful. Before I retired in December of last year, we were in the midst of the pandemic, and I personally noticed visibly a lot of what was happening in the Chinatown International District area, just because you would encounter folks who would say things. All of a sudden you became a target because you're physically, visibly an Asian working in the Asian community. And so it was a pretty horrific time. More recently, because of the media attention, this anti-Asian attacks, have increased. And in my own mind, I'm not totally sure that it's necessarily that big of a spike, because it's always been there. If you've worked in Chinatown International District area for a long time, you know that the seniors down there have always been targeted for robberies, for whatever, because they know that many of them don't speak English and they're vulnerable and police aren't going to respond to them. And so it's always been there, but I notice even more recently in my own experience as a runner, as you mentioned, I've been jogging up on Beacon Hill and harassed. I've lived in Seattle all my life. I'm shocked, so there's clearly, some way in which being physically identifiable, can leave you vulnerable in a way that is very unsettling. It doesn't help, again, when you have pronouncements, particularly from a national leadership level that, seems to make you seem like you, regardless of what you do, you will always be a foreigner. So there's some education work, obviously, that has to happen there.
Yeah, what I would say is there's a couple thoughts that come to my mind. So it is for Jews, there are Black Jews, there are Asian Jews, there are Latino Jews. I mean, like, it's an interesting, strange thing to be Jewish in part of a community. What I'd say is, as it relates to that, one, you can be white and people can somehow still say you're Jewish, right? Regardless of your last name, they just look, you say you look Jewish. So I don't even know really what it means to say you look Jewish, but there's a stereotype that if you fall into that, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. Two, I'd say, interestingly, what they were chanting in Charlottesville was actually Jews will not replace us, right? So that is like a uber statement. You are not one of us. You will not replace us. And I think that's persistent. And then the other thing, which I'd be curious if this exists. Well, it's going to exist differently for sure based on what you just said. But it's almost like it doesn't matter what the external world, like it doesn't matter that I present as a white person, because my perception of myself, based on what I've been taught and told and external from society at large, is you're other, right? So I don't know if you asked my kids if they would say that, but if you're sort of raised with this sort of drumbeat, and what I encounter, by the way, about this is that as anti-Semitism rise, the next generation starts to recognize the same thing that the previous generation understood, right? So I grew up really in the shadow of the Holocaust. So I was raised with, around survivors, around people telling their story. And this is, I think, interesting as just a very similar experience, and I'll share because I think it's relevant, is and I'm riffing, so I apologize, it's how I sort of think, train of thought. So I took our kids to there was Asian Pacific Islander festival at the Seattle Center many years ago when they were little, and we were going from booth to booth to booth, and my kids were young, really young, and I remember somebody at one of the booths talking about the incarceration and the concentration camps. And I thought to myself, I'm not telling my own kids about that experience within the Jewish community. So what does it mean? And how are they interpreting that this is an experience that another community had? And I bring that up because one of the things I think we need to be careful about, and we need to really think, how do we raise a generation, the next generation? And in Judaism, we always talk about guilt and fear Judaism, right? Like, they tried to kill us, you survived, your family survived, you have an obligation, and if you don't follow that obligation, you should feel terrible about yourself, right? Like, it's a real guilt and fear mentality, as opposed to, and I'm speaking now from Jewish experience, not the mechanism of somebody's death in terms of the Holocaust, but what did they live for? What was their lives, and how do we share the richness of that? And what does it mean when we impart a kind of a vicarious post-traumatic stress disorder to the next generation? And then how does that manifest in how we see ourselves as part of the world, right? So, like, for me, I may be able to pass very clearly as white, and I don't walk around thinking of myself as a white guy. I mean, I think of myself as, like, I'm constantly aware. I mean, even today I was on a call where somebody was saying, like, are you concerned about, threats to your house, threats to your family? And it's like, it's just a constant thing in the background. And I think it's interesting, Ron, I'm also a runner, is what I don't fear is being targeted as a Jew while I'm running, right? But I don't know if you were to ask, say, my dad or my grandfather, who grew up with the Cossacks coming in and trying to murder them, whether or not how they would view that. Because there's just this, again, there's this internalized part, not internalized anti-Semitism, but an internalized part of who am I in this society and how welcome am I in this society, and how quickly that can be taken away.
I appreciate those comments from both of you. I'm just kind of looking at the chat here, and John Bridge has said that on a more recent time, there was a great relationship between the JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, and the local AJC, both working diligently for reparations for the Japanese American community. And Stan Shikuma, who is from the JACL, says, yes, AJC was one of the staunchest allies in the fight for reparations for Japanese Americans in the 1980s. So this suggests not just a social community relationship, but a powerful political relationship as well. I'd like you to maybe comment about the political issues that are bringing the communities together today.
Yeah, so I appreciate both John and Stan's comments because as I'm sitting here thinking, one of the big challenges is really retrieving some of that history and knowing that we do have examples of where our communities have crossed those boundaries and worked together to create positive, progressive social change. When I was working on my memoir, My Unforgotten Style, and reflecting on my own history and the community's history, it occurred to me there's so much that we have not passed on to our children's generation, because I see and mentor a lot of the younger activists, and I'm inspired by Black Lives Matter and Stop AAPI Hate and the many related movements that have blossomed. But, I remember when the Chinatown International District they were trying to restore it in the early 1970s when they constructed the Kingdom and those threats to the community. Well, a lot of the movement to rebuild the community, to preserve it, to redevelop it, came from not simply the Asian American student activists, but a lot of the African American, Latinx, Native American leadership who were working in coalition. They were at the demonstrations. They were at the housing struggle down at the old Milwaukee Hotel. They were there as part of the Jackson Street Community Council, this multi-ethnic coalition, even this generation back. So I think we need to study and resurface that history. That's part of the reason I was drawn to the museum. It was just this desire to search for what our history really is, and then taking responsibility to ensure that that gets passed on. Because unless we pass that on, we're trying to reinvent something that is much harder to do, because it comes from a place of not knowing that you're really building on something that the infrastructure is already there. You just need to reactivate it.
I want Rabbi Will to react to that, because you talk about not wanting to pass on the trauma to the next generation, but trauma and history are, related. And I really think the history that you do pass on has to be authentic and true. And, if it results in trauma, there must be a way to deal with that. What are your thoughts on?
So a couple thoughts. One, so I've written or spoken about this, but there's no, and it's in Hebrew the word is zachor. There's no word for history in tradition. The word we use is memory. So we're not passing on our history, you're passing on memory, and that's a live thing, right? And it's the passing on of memory and the rituals that allow for the passing on of that memory, which is so critical. And I think of this all the time. Like, I was raised with railroad tracks in the backyard, so the train would sort of shake the whole house when it would go by. My kids do not have that experience, right? I was raised with, Yiddish around the house and going down to the delicatessen with my mom. My kids would rather have sushi, so there's just like a so fundamental difference in how we hold and pass along those stories. And I think I think it's critical that we tell the story of the traumatic events. So don't hear me say we don't. And I think in Judaism, you don't start talking about the mystical tradition until your 40s. You've studied everything, you're married, it's like you have to be grounded, and then you start exploring the more esoteric stuff. So I think when it comes to the traumatic side in the Jewish experience, what I would suggest is, I think first, let's give young people a positive experience of the tradition and the stories. And then as they're older, then you can talk about the stuff that's not positive. But if you start with the traumatic, that is the thing that I'm more concerned about, if that makes sense. The holidays are the other way in which we pass along in Judaism ritual, right? So Passover would be a good holiday. Why do we, why is JFS so passionate about resettling refugees? In fact, we have a whole department, a very large department, which is about refugee resettlement. Resettling started with resettling Jews, but then over time it evolved, and we were resettling people from Asian and Pacific Islanders, resettling people from all over the world, none of whom happen to be Jewish today. But why do we do that? Because we're a refugee people. We're a people from our earliest tradition, our earliest memories is that of a refugee. So we have a holiday, the holiday of Passover, which is rooted in that concept of you were strangers in a strange land, right? So you know what it's like. You have an obligation. That's what I want to be teaching our kids. And then later on, we can talk about, well, what happened when they were strangers in that strange land? But that doesn't need to be first in the front. And then I also think different generations feel a need to tell their story, because they recognize, right now there's only going to maybe a few more years where Holocaust survivors will still be alive, right? Because that story, and that's probably very true with Japanese internment as well, they're going to fade into history. And then for a younger person, that becomes ancient history. Like, it's not like, hey, this is basically in my lifetime. And that's the magic, is being able to do that in a way which a young person can see themselves in that story and see their values as a lived, vibrant, vital thing, and not as a history.
Ron, anything else to add to that?
Well, just one thought that occurred to me, and again, I'm going back to my memoir, which I partly talked a little bit about the Japanese American incarceration story, but I told it through the story of two people I know on a local level who worked very hard on the issue. Ruth Ann Karose, who worked for, at the time, U.S. Representative Mike Lowry, who introduced the first redress legislation, and then Karen Saraguchi, who worked organizing on a regional level. But in researching that, I was struck by the fact that while we often talk about one group's struggle for social justice, it's only made possible by the support of other groups. And again, we sort of forget that. I know I made that point earlier, but I was reflecting because in this time period with the Black Lives Matter, for example, I know from having gone jogging with Ruth Ann on a regular basis that the Congressional Black Caucus is very instrumental in helping ensure that the reparations move forward. Kathy Haley, was a point person who worked with the Congressional Black Caucus on that. So the African American community, in addition, of course, the Jewish American community here locally, was very supportive, very instrumental in making that happen. When state employees, Japanese Americans who were affected by the incarceration, got reparations, it was George Fleming, African American state senator, who introduced the legislation. And when the Japanese American school district employees got reparations because they were fired from their jobs, so forth, it was T.J. Vassar, African American school board member, who introduced the legislation. So I'm real mindful of this, that we need to unearth our history, and then at the same time we need to pivot and think about, in this time period where, for example, we see this rise in anti-Semitic incidents, where we see police incidents involving the African American community. We need to step up as well. I'm talking about Asian Americans. See, we don't, if we don't teach that history, if we don't share those stories, people don't realize, well, hey, people were there for us. And so we need to be there for them, because we're all involved in the same struggle.
I remember in the early years of King 5, we had a public service program where we brought together a rabbi. I mean, this sounds like a terrible joke, but there was a rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister together. And they had like a little half-hour talk show. And it was a wonderful show because it was once a week where you could hear from these various religious community leaders. And it showed a certain amount of solidarity, if you will. It showed a lot of dedication to common goals. I think I really miss having that program because it gave us a reason to remind ourselves, yeah, we're in this together. We're facing similar struggles. Let's work together. I don't know that there's really a vehicle like that today, either on television or even in the community. There's no galvanizing issue right now. And even if there were something like anti-Semitic actions in Seattle or anti-Asian harassment in Seattle, even with that, I don't necessarily see or Black Lives Matter for that. I don't see that coalescing as much, as often. What is your sense of the collaboration between the communities today?
I would say, so interestingly, I think the Seattle Foundation is working, they have a project called We Belong Here, which I think is a version of that. And they've done some very nice work in Frank Nahm, Michael Brown are the two folks who I think are kind of the key on that. So I'm part of a, pretty regular conversation with them and a group of other sort of folks in town on one level. So I think that there's these conversations happening, but it's not happening as a civil discourse, as a larger, who are we? Who do we want to be? What does it mean to be part of a group? And how do we recognize that there are things we're not going to all agree? It's not reasonable to just do kumbaya because that's not honest, right? But also to recognize that hey, there was expanding the circle of understanding so that we look for the places of overlap as opposed to looking for the places of difference. And I feel like that's one of the things that's shifted is there's a lot of highlighting difference rather than highlighting commonality. And then how do we talk about our difference from within commonality? There's also a group of rabbis and ministers that I'm a part of, primarily, Black ministers and essentially Ashkenazic rabbis, who meet as well. And so but these are happening really in sort of smaller settings. They're not happening as you're describing, which would be so wonderful if there was a way for us to have a collective conversation. And much like what you're doing today, Lori, in a moderated way, where we're talking about things of the heart and things of the soul rather than political things. And not to say that those aren't political things, but there's a difference in terms of when you talk from a more centered place of the heart, so to speak.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on today. Again, we mentioned the rise in anti-Semitic activity since all this has kind of broken loose in Gaza. And of course, last year and even into this year, the anti-Asian harassment that's going on because of COVID-19. What can be done to turn down the rhetoric? It's getting unreal. I almost don't want to turn on the television myself because I don't want to hear any more of this horrible stuff. What can be done to turn it down, get some agreement instead of disagreement going? Any thoughts on that?
Boy, if we had the answer, I think Will and I would be going out and having lunch somewhere. It's a tough one. It mirrors how our society has, become very factionalized. Our sources of information are different. There are ways that we can, huddle in our corner and not, and create our own factoids, and live off of those factoids. So it, it's a challenging thing. These conversations that we have here, can move us a little closer to solutions. I don't think there's one slam dunk solution. I think it's really in a lot of the little organizing work, the conversations people have in the workplaces, among organizations that can work in coalition. I'm heartened by a lot of the young folks. Again, that they live in a very polarized era, but then they also, we've got a generation of folks who now, and maybe I'm just speaking more about the API community, but I'm not as knowledgeable about the Jewish community, but, we have people who are much more diverse, so we have so many different groups, and we have people with mixed ancestry, we serve as bridges, which in part reflects a lot of intermarriage, so people are talking, right? We have a huge adoptee population that, so there's a lot more, I would say, hope that I have, just because there are more potential points of intersection. And, even in the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-API hate, I've seen some intersection points where some dialogue is starting. There still needs to be a lot more, but I don't know, Will, what your thoughts, but to me, I'm hopeful. So
it's interesting. I think I'm hopeful, but I'm also a realist. I think that my big thing is we need people to be more curious about each other. I think we need to learn how to live in the gray. We live in a world where, the far right, is certain and the far left is certain, and all those in the middle. And I sort of feel I'm kind of probably like a radical centrist in a certain way, in that, and I think as journalists, you guys would relate to this. It's like our job is, I used to be a journalist when I was younger, is to ask questions, right? And to learn. I just literally just got out of the Grand Canyon. I was 23 days in the wilderness, and there was no cell phone, there was no internet. And the conversations we had were very real, because we were talking about our lives. We weren't talking about the latest political news because we didn't know what it was. And I think that learning how to live in the gray, and that it's not black and white. It's never been black and white. It's all gray. And it's much more complicated than people want to understand it to be, would like it to be. And it's easier to, they are all bad, they are all good. And that's not the world we live in. And until we all own the messy, kind of dirty craziness of our humanity, and then humanity is essentially, our societies are groups of people, that just expands. And we need to teach people how to live in the gray, and that means looking for sources of information beyond what is just going to affirm what you already believe is true. And then that comes from being curious. But I don't think we have created a very good model of how to be curious and how to live in the gray and how to make decisions that are gray and slowing down. And that to me is, back in the day, used to be there were 3 news stations when I was growing up. So our basic nature of truth was, the key news stations would tell, and then we would agree or disagree, but we were all looking in the same direction. Now, the same kind of whack job that used to have a newsletter in his basement and send it out to 50 people could send it out to 50 million people. And that becomes the truth. And in the absence of that, where are we as a society? So that part does not make me overly hopeful, because we need to have the will as individuals to change our choices and our behavior. And I haven't seen that happen to the degree that I would hope it would.
I'm going to take just a quick moment to kind of recap what we were just discussing in the last few minutes about what to do about divisiveness, and then we're going to just pivot and turn to some of the audience questions. So what I'm hearing from Rabbi Will, and we're all journalists here, basically, the 3 of us, is that the role of journalism and and the consumption of journalism has changed dramatically. People are looking at their own resources and in some cases their own truths. And so there has to be a continued dialogue, which I was glad to hear Ron is seeing. And Rabbi, well, you're having those conversations too, albeit in smaller groups. But we have to continue this conversation and education so that we can agree on a common truth. We get into trouble when the truth for one group is different from the truth of another group, and that's where conflict erupts. We have a question from Bill who says, any thoughts about hate crimes and the way to handle them? Some talk of restorative justice. Others simply want to make sure that vulnerable communities feel safe. Comments about how we should react to hate crimes.
Well, I was encouraged by the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act because it's first and foremost just an acknowledgement that this is an issue. I do think we need our political leaders to step up and confront these issues, much like the whole issue of gun violence. And at some point, we need political leaders to put together some meaningful legislation to stop, the proliferation of guns that, are used to kill people. I think, I think it all has to really start with some, political leadership and some courage. Will, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
One, I think we need greater moral leadership at all levels, because I don't think that moral leadership is some, is an MLK kind of thing or a Gandhi kind of thing. I think it's the individual, and that means being willing to call out your friends when they say things, and it means being willing to question our own thoughts and our own decisions. And I think, and then it means actually societally stepping up when there are hate crimes. Like, it can't be the Jewish community is going to be the only one that's shouting from the rooftops when there's anti-Semitism. It can't be it's only the Black community when there's something terrible happening within the Black community, the Asian Pacific Islander community. Like, that's not going to work, right? Because that's essentially, that forces a retreat. Right? Like, if we don't take care of ourselves, no one else is going to take care of us. Like, we need to be able to step into the edging around the forest, which is like, I can retreat to my people, but I want to step out a little further, and that requires a true collective effort. I could speak more. I could speak on this, but I don't want to keep going. But that would be my initial thought.
Okay, so we have another comment about the idea of news coverage journalism when hate crimes or other kind of bad news happens. It's part of the problem. If it bleeds, it leads. News coverage where that's just used to maybe shock and maybe further divide people, rather than news stories about coalitions trying to achieve social justice. So there's maybe a role that journalism is not fulfilling to its fullest here, that they're continuing to be sensational where they could try to be more educational. I don't know. I tend to personally see, maybe it's because I'm looking for it, I tend to see coverage of different communities, especially the AAPI community in light of anti-harassment, the harassment area. I see people like NBC Asian America covering doing longer form stories about efforts to bring communities together, to defend the elderly, to educate school children, that kind of thing. So I don't know, there might be a role that journalism is lacking or not fulfilling here as well.
Lori, just one thought on that, and obviously you've been in the journalism arena, probably paralleling my time in journalism field as well. But I've been heartened by the fact that you now have a generation of certainly, when I watch the news, Asian American journalists who are reporting on and offering commentary about the incidents of anti-Asian violence and this othering and foreignizing of AAPIs, which, back when you were at the heart of your reporting career, I doubt if I would have been shocked to have seen that. Of course, I'm still shocked now to see that actually, because it comes from also a very personal place, because a lot of these reporters have shared their own experiences. Back in the day, I'm assuming that if you're Asian American, it's like you're biased. You don't cover that story. It's assigned to a white reporter or something. So I think we've made a little bit of progress, and I'm heartened by the fact that we do have people who are covering these things. Granted, again, it takes it from the perspective of not necessarily covering some of the positive aspects of the coalition building happening behind the scenes, but maybe that's part of the nature of the news and how it's sort of structured.
I would sort of add, we live in a hashtag world and a tweetable world, and your comment about long form journalism, it takes time to tell a story. It takes time to understand the complexity of a situation. It's not something you can tweet. It's not something you can hashtag, something that will get a lot of eyes. And again, that is just not the world. It's complexity and understanding how to understand and parse complexity, and that's what good journalism does, right? It's not this like, I'm shocked whenever. I mean, it's amazing to me. Everything is breaking news. It's like not everything is breaking news. No. And that's part of the problem, because I need to click on this in order for the advertising, and that's until we get. And I don't know that we can change that anymore, but social media will just take you down a rabbit hole to tell you it's emotional hate, it's emotional hits to like get me angry about something and spun up, but that's not, that's not reality, right? The breaking news, like, let's be real about what's really important, and let's talk about those things, and let's unpack those things, rather than like, oh, it's going to be, I need to make a clear story and it has to look like this, and because that's not objective either. And I think all of those things are what we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of society do we want to leave for our children?
Okay, we are probably down to our last question, and I wanted to end on a fairly positive note and a constructive one too, so that members of the audience have a takeaway, something that they can mull, something that they can actually take action on as they leave today. How do we model curiosity and relationship building outside of our own communities for our children? What can we do to model positive solutions for our own kids?
Well, I think about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Ever since, once you got kids, you got to shape up, right? Because they watch and absorb everything. But I've always believed that how you create more lasting change is really in how you behave yourself. If you truly are interested in having your kids believe in a society where people are equally valued, that's how you treat other people, because they see how you deal with folks. They're watching even when you don't think they're watching. They're absorbing when you don't think they're absorbing. Because later, as they grow older, and my kids are still in their 20s, so I've seen how they pick up things and they become what they see. That's the one thing you can control. I mean, so I don't know if real journalism is going to come back in this era where we don't have a funding model to support quality journalism. I don't know, the enduring value of certain coalition building that's happening, which I fully support and am part of. But what you can control is how you behave with some level of mindfulness. We're not perfect, but if you believe in a truly tolerant society. I mean, and that's the way you treat other people. If you believe in packing a gun everywhere you go, that's that's the kind of kids you're going to raise. So it's a lot of just, I think, working within the circle that you control as well.
Okay. And finally, Rabbi Will.
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One, there's the hard T truths and there's the fuzzy T truths. And I think being able to distinguish between the two is one thing. I think there's a woman who wrote a book called Common Fire. I think it's Sharon Parks Dolan's. She talks about having a house with doors and windows where you can open the doors and windows to let in the world beyond your, I am part of the Jewish community. I'm rooted in the Jewish community, but I want my kids to see that we have people of all types coming through our home and are part of multiple conversations. And they are people that look and think very differently, and truly, meaning like they might be really Republican and they may have very different views than I have. They might be really Democrat or very progressive on the other side. But creating a home where our kids can encounter people who are really, really different than us. And I think that requires effort. And as it goes back to what I said about my dad in the beginning, it did not require the kind of effort for my dad because he was in World War II. It was these are the people who was around. It was the people who he grew up in the ghettos with, like it's that kind of thing. We need to create a culture where our doors are open, our windows are open, and we're willing to let difference come through them.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Will and Ronald Chu.
Thank you.
Let's toss it over now to Li-Ching Tran for final words.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you again to our panelists, Ron Chu, Rabbi Will Berkovitz, and of course our wonderful moderator, Lori Matsukawa, for all your time and insights and this great conversation. I want to once again thank our event co-hosts, the Asian Hall of Fame, the Holocaust Center for Humanity, International Community Health Services, the International Examiner, Jewish American Citizens League, Seattle, Jewish Community Relations Council for the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, Jewish Family Services of Seattle, OCA Greater Seattle, Robert Chinn Foundation, Temple de Hirsch Sinai, and the Washington State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. We hope the last hour has been valuable to you and that you learned something new and perhaps take away some new perspectives or thoughts that you hadn't had before today, and a deeper appreciation for each other's communities and the relationships between Jewish Americans and Asian Americans. As AAPI Heritage Month and Jewish American Heritage Month wraps up, we hope that you will keep the spirit of this discussion with you, continue to tell your stories, build relationships from the heart, and stand up for each other together through conversation and collaboration. Thank you all for spending your time with us today. It's been a pleasure. We wish we had more time to talk longer, but fortunately we have to wrap up. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful night, everybody.